What's up, everybody? This is Jay, and this is the true story and downfall of the BMF Black Mafia Family. Now, a lot of people are more familiar with this group and organization than ever before, thanks to the TV show and increased popularity, but Big Meech, Demetrius Flintery, and Southwest T, Flintery, the brothers, did some amazing things in the underworld dope game, and I'm gonna break it down and explain their downfall. So make sure you hit that like, subscribe, bang that bell, all that good stuff. Sit back and I'm gonna tell you the story of these two brothers. Now, Demetrius and Flintery, also known as the Flenory Brothers, did some things coming from Detroit in the dope game that probably never will ever be done again. They had nearly a 15-year run as kings in the dope game and moved upwards of over $200+ million. Now, their downfall became shortly after, coincidentally, Puff Daddy was running the New York City Marathon. Now, in November 2nd, 2003, 10 days later, Puff ended up having to make funeral plans because it was a double homicide in Atlanta at Club Chaos. Now, the reason this had something to do with Puff Daddy is because his bodyguard, Wolf, was murdered. Okay, and that began to bring a lot of attention to him. At around 4 a.m., dozens of rounds was fired at Club Chaos. It left 2 people dead, and it was 38-year-old Anthony Wolf Jones from New York and 38-year-old Lamont Gertie from Brooklyn that was living in Atlanta that died in the hospital. Now, Grady, he died later in the hospital. Now, Wolf Jones was Puffy's bodyguard, and he was present during the J-Lo and Puffy trials when they went to court over gun charges in the 90s, in 1999. Now, Puff was indicted on the gun and bribery charges after the shootout in Club New York with that situation with J-Lo that left 3 people wounded. They were both acquitted later from those charges. The jury found them not guilty on all charges, and Wolf was said to have refused to back down while in Atlanta at Club Chaos. It was said that he had got into it with some of the people from BMF over a former girlfriend, and that she was sitting with some of the people from the BMF at the BMF table, and that he got upset. He was tossed from the Club Chaos for arguing with one of the bosses from BMF, allegedly Big Meech, and Wolf and his childhood friend Gertie both ended up dead, allegedly waiting to do something to the BMF when they got out. And in that altercation, Meech ended up in the hospital as well. He was actually shot in the butt. Now, Meech told cops later that he didn't know anything and that he was actually running away, and that is why he was shot in the ass. Okay, now Meech was arrested, and that exploded the BMF image in a good way, actually, because it seemed the popularity started to explode. It was free Meech t-shirts everywhere and all kind of BMF merchandise, and he became somewhat of a hood hero at that time. Now, authorities at that moment had no idea that they locked up half of the drug empire BMF. At BMF's peak, they covered most of the country with product. The government at one time seized hundreds of millions of dollars in drug money and product from them. They were definitely game changers. Now, some law enforcement felt that they were a national security threat to the country because of the amount of product and resources that they had control of. And even though they came from Detroit, they had spread to both coasts, east and west. Now, people say Big Meech is the most influential drug lord of the last half century, and that he had definitely the gift of gab. Terry, he was lesser known of the brothers, but that was by design. He was known as incredibly smart and calculating, and he thinks many moves ahead on the chessboard. He tried to be invisible as much as possible. They started this drug game in the 80s, and by 2000 were the #1 wholesaler coke dealers in America. Now, they split the country between them, east and west, between Terry and Meech. The vehicles that they had trap doors to hide the guns, drugs, and money, and they moved kilos from state to state. Now, they bought Mercedes, Benz to Maybach with cash, Bentleys to Ferrari. They were known to be flashy and extravagant. Meech was extremely flamboyant, and that repeatedly made Terry mad because, of course, in the dope game, you don't want to bring too much attention to him. Now, according to the records, Terry was 2 years younger than Meech, and he was known as Southwest T. They were, although brothers, exact opposites of each other. People said Terry seemed like a regular person, and most wouldn't have expected him to be in the drug game at all. He always kept a low profile, but by the end of their reign, they weren't even on speaking terms. Now, Big Meech style was way too flashy and over the top. Meech would spend $15,000 a night at the club and allegedly started the term "make it rain" at a strip club. Now, we see Meech felt that the notoriety was good for business, and Terry, on the other hand, felt that Meech had started a war and between himself and the police department by being so flashy and flamboyant and flaunting all this drug money and power in their face. Terry began to get more and more upset with Meech about the cars, about the club chaos shooting, and all the attention that it brought. In Atlanta, police got very little help in trying to solve this case because nobody was talking and saying anything against the BMF. Meech had an airtight defense in his mind because he said he was shot in the booty and there was no evidence to keep Meech in jail, and it was no one stepping forward, and within days he was out of jail. Now, when he was back in the club, he was passing out BMF t-shirts to people in the club, and even though they came from Southwest Detroit, it seems that Atlanta became Meech's new home turf. Now, when they started in Detroit in the 80s, they was known as the 50 Rock Boys because they sold $50 bags of crack cocaine. Now, Detroit area is split between East and West, and Southwest was mostly the factory area. They did have the old Detroit Tiger Stadium there and a lot of other things, but that was where they began to operate. Lived in a bungalow on Edsel Street, which was their family home. Now, their family was poor. They were on welfare, but the moms and dad was very religious. They would pray, make sure that they had what they needed, that the check came on time, things of that nature, something that, is not too unfamiliar in the black neighborhood. Now, in the 1950s, Detroit was the most economically successful community in America. But 20 years later, it fell all apart, and that was around the time that Meech and Terry began to come up. Now, most people left the city of Detroit, and in 1967, the Detroit riots burned a big part of the city up. Now, Detroit was the crack capital in the 80s. They started selling weed and then coke when they started in the dope game, Meech and Terry. By the 90s, they wanted to leave Detroit. They decided to set up in LA and Atlanta. They got connected to the Mexican cartel, and that allowed them to grow to a large scale. Detroit was their cut sitter, and then they distributed throughout the network. but Detroit, they still kept as their main hub, and they had managers in each city. They kind of had this like a corporation set up. They started a business in Los Angeles named Oracle Motorsports. Now they began to provide accessories to high-end cars, and that was a good cover-up for their business. They made secret compartments in these cars, and some cars would need to be in reverse with the AC on and a magnet up to the windshield with the sunroof open for it to work. They didn't make it very simple to open these compartments. They were very elaborate, which was extremely smart. Now, Atlanta was a place with opportunities for them. When they got to Atlanta, they was able to recruit other distributors because they were flashy and had all the money, and then the other distributors wanted to get some of the same money and power that they had, and they took Atlanta over like a storm. Meech, a fan of Al Pacino from Scarface, he used The World is BMF from Scarface and put it on billboards around Atlanta with his face all over it. Now, a lot of police began to see it, and they was wondering what that was about because it really had no meaning. It was just publicity. And so that brought a lot of attention to BMF, and especially because the sign was near the airport and people saw it before they saw the Welcome to Atlanta sign, it became to be a major problem for him. Meech used BMF as a front, and he wanted to be in the music business. He created the Black Mafia Family enterprise in March of 2004 in California. He was the face of BMF Entertainment. He wanted to be a part of the Atlanta rap scene. BMF only had one artist, and his name was Barima McKnight, aka Blue Da Vinci. Now, Blue Da Vinci came from LA and moved to Atlanta. He looked up to Meech as a father figure in the game. He never had any of his music available, and no documents ever were to show where BMF's money came from. It was an open secret on the streets that they were big-time drug dealers. NBA All Weekend 2003, they hit the scene hard. They brought theyself and put theyself on the map in a major way. They would all be coordinating their clothes like black BMF or white BMF camo. They spent big money in all the clubs, and they didn't have any assets or property in their name to show for any of all this large income. They had no legitimate sources for income. They filed no taxes in years, and cops began to wonder, where did all this money come from? 9 months after making a splash on the scene for the NBA All-Star Weekend, BMF ran into the big bad wolf. Now, he and his childhood friend were killed at Club Chaos. Lamont Gertie was his childhood friend. The authorities believe that they were waiting to actually ambush members of the BMF, but it went wrong and they ended up dead themselves. Meech was arrested as the suspect, but also was treated as a victim because he was shot. The killing brought BMF to the spotlight. It also made the city decide to close clubs earlier than they used to. Now, although not enough evidence was there to hold Meech for the double homicide, authorities were suspected of BMF's involvement. DEA agents got a warrant to search a house connected to BMF known as the White House on Bel Air Lake, East Road in Atlanta. Okay, now they found that drug records and vehicle records of 19 different cars and titles, ledgers with names and phone numbers. They didn't find any drugs or guns in the house though, and no paperwork tied directly back to Meech, but instead a company named Exquisite Empire. On October 2003, cops were working another investigation following a drug dealer who was in a high-end BMW. He was arrested and the car was seized, and inside they found a business card for Exquisite Empire. Car records for the car were found in the White House. In an Excel spreadsheet, the car was listed as BMF. They noticed a lot of cars listed as being BMF on paperwork. In June 2004, 7 months after the Club Chaos came the Velvet Room incident. Leaving the club, and they had a bunch of cars outside, like limos, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Bentleys, etc. And as they were backing up, a guy walking behind the car tapped the car because they almost hit him, and he tapped the car to let them know, hey, I'm walking here, watch out. And they got extremely offended because he touched their car. So members of the BMF got out of the car and beat the dude to a pulp. They beat the damn boogers out this man to the point where he was extremely, beat till he was unconscious. Now, while he was on the ground from the beatdown, a member of the BMF shot and killed him in the parking lot. Rashonable Prince Drummond was 23 years old. His mother was crying about her baby being killed and that there was no need to shoot him because he was not only beat to the bloody mess, but he was unconscious at the time they shot him. The BMF image started to go down after that incident, and people began to see them as bullies. Despite the fact that people were on the scene when it happened, no one testified still. It was the beginning of the end because he now had a major target on his back after killing that kid. Feds began to come after him. In 2015, we had the show Empire, which had Lucius Lyon, and it kind of gave an example of what BMF was trying to do, but never accomplished. Now, Meech would have probably been able to accomplish something like Lucius Lyon had he actually put the time into promoting his artists. He definitely had enough money to make any artist successful, but they never did. Now, in the summer of 2004, after surviving a shooting and a parking lot incident, Meech threw a birthday party for his 36th birthday. It was a party fit for a king. It was called Meech of the Jungle Party, as in King of the Jungle. He rented zoo animals. He had his name spelled in 8-foot neon letters. He had lions and giraffes and elephants all at the fanciest club in town. He had no idea that the feds were in deep investigation of BMF at that moment. It began with the weapon search following the killing of Anthony Jones. After the search at the White House, they realized it was really Terry's operation. Months and years later, those documents they seized were key to their investigation of the BMF. The car registration and money ledgers with names and phone numbers, they began to trace the owner of the White House back to a woman living in California who was living in a luxury home on Mulholland Drive. She was paying $12,000 a month to lease the house and then bought it for $500,000. Her bank records had cashier checks for $10,000 and $12,000. Then they followed where the cashier checks came from. They eventually find out that she was Terry's girlfriend. They get authorization to wiretap a phone, which led to wiretapping Terry. Terry had like 10 phones at the time and would use different phones when he spoke to different people. Cops would hear things and know a deal was going down, but couldn't pinpoint where the deal was. Cops said when most of the conversations ended, they would say one. It meant one family. Now, Terry, he liked to talk on the phone, and he talked a lot of business on the phone. He would call his sister and complain about Meech and his flashiness. He called and complained about the billboard that he put up in Atlanta. Terry started to pull away from Meech and would only communicate with him through third-party intermediaries. Meech was in disbelief and didn't want to hear that his flashiness was a problem. Meech's flashiness caused Terry to talk on the phone more and more to complain about the business and what Meech was doing. It was a huge mistake on Terry's part. In the summer of 2004, investigators catch Terry on the phone talking about a BMF courier that was stopped in Detroit with 10 kilos of product. That was a huge mistake on Terry's part, because cops took the registration from that car and tied it back to paperwork that had it as a BMF car. They began to look for significant drug or money bust across the country and match it with the vehicle records from the White House that they seized. 5 vehicles turned up in seizures across the country, and it was always big money like $500,000 or $800,000 that was seized in these vehicles. It's not illegal to have money, but reports were being made and they were starting to put the pieces together. Cops would find phone numbers for the Flenerys or other members of BMF. In 2005, feds were targeting Meech heavy. Meech had announced that they were going to have a reopening for Club Babylon, which was actually the same name of the club that was in Scarface. Feds issued a warrant for Meech right-hand man, Chad Brown, aka J-Bo. He was wanted on a minor charge of carrying false identification. He was like the CEO of BMF. They left the club together with J-Bo behind the wheel of a Bentley. Cops followed them and arrested J-Bo for false driver's license. Meech took the wheel, and cops knew Meech didn't have a driver's license either. They pulled him over a few blocks later and took him to jail also. They both bonded out, and cops did seize Meech's personal jewelry. Meech had a ring, watch, and chain, and a pair of earrings. Now, the government had all of that jewelry appraised by a gemologist, and it came back worth $2.6 million. He didn't even try to get any of it back, which was a huge red flag, because not many people would have $2.6 million worth of jewelry seized from them and just leave it. That was very unusual. And so they said that he would also spend up to $100,000 at a strip club on the regular, which was extremely odd behavior for a regular person. They noticed that they would rent SUV limos so they could go to Philadelphia for All-Star game or to Vegas to party, and whenever the law touched anything that they had, they never wanted it back or came back for it, whether it was jewelry, house, car, anything that was touched by the law, F it. And Meech didn't pick that jewelry back up. He just went and ordered new pieces, more jewelry. Now, his cars that were impounded, he would later just take them back to the lien holders. They wouldn't keep them, and the house would be abandoned. So that was extremely red flag, strange behavior that they never went back for any of their property once it was touched by the cops. Now, they had been operating for at least about 15 years at this point, but cops had been building up evidence on them by this time. By May 2005, Bobby Brown was celebrating his birthday at a restaurant, Justin's, which is actually owned by Puff Daddy, and his family was there, and he was singing, and everybody was having a good time. Somehow, there was a scuffle in the crowd. Man was stabbed. That man was 24-year-old Shane Brown, and he was stabbed in his face and neck, and doctors believed the weapon was an ice pick. People said the guy who did the stabbing was Baby Blue. His real name was Marquis Dixon. He was related to Blue Da Vinci, who was the only artist on the BMF label. It turns out, though, they weren't actually brothers, but they were both from LA and extremely close friends. Nevertheless, Dixon was found dead of gunshot wounds the next year. Now, it was hard for investigators to get information on BMF because they didn't have any insiders, and in order to take down an organization like that, you always need an insider, basically somebody to flip, snitch, tell, whatever it is you want to call it. Cops got a break though when they arrested O-Dog Omari McRee. Now, he was the dealer and he got his supply from BMF. He was picked up November 2004, but was quickly released. They let him go because they had a wire on his phone and hoped that he would connect him to Meech. And he was arrested again in 2005, responding to a domestic dispute. Now, cops asked who was the boss, and he said Meech. He began to flip. And now he said he actually worked for Meech, and that was the first time someone so close ever said anything against the BMF. He was facing a jury trial for coke trafficking, and he pled guilty on opening day. 2 months later, the government began indictment of BMF, everyone that had helped them and had anything to do with it. On October 2005, Meech and Terry are charged with running a criminal enterprise. Meech was found the first in Frisco, Texas, outside of Dallas, hiding. He had weapons in his house, and Terry was found later in a house in St. Louis that had money and was used to process product. The evidence showed that they had been in business for at least 15 years at that point. The money judgment in the case was over $270 million. Now, based on what investigators estimated at that amount of product that they sold during their time in business was over $300 million. Now, it may not even be as close to the real amount because there's no way to actually know what they did. Now, over the next years, more than 150 people were indicted with connections with the BMF. People from dealers like Jacob the Jeweler, Jacob Arabo, he was indicted for money laundering because he took cash for jewelry without reporting it to the IRS, and that he was arrested for that and spent 2.5 years in prison because of it. Now, Meech and Terry were put in separate facilities once they were arrested, and they began to actually blame each other for the downfall of the BMF. Terry blamed Meech for being too flashy and bringing attention to their organization, and Meech blamed Terry for talking on the phone too much and being the one they actually were able to wiretap and get information from. The truth is that Terry's phone calls had the biggest impact with incriminating evidence against the BMF organization. The brothers never spoke to each other or the cops, though. They never flipped to the cops against each other and cut a deal. Terry had never been arrested or spent a day in jail before this point and wasn't used to that life. Now, Terry thought that he was going to get a bond, and not realizing that this was a massive case and that he wasn't going to get a bond. They were actually facing mandatory life in prison at that point. Now, Meech pled guilty to running a criminal organization on November 19th, 2007, 2 years after being locked up. Meech tried to convince Terry to plead guilty. At that point, they were still on bad terms, and then they had to have a face-to-face meeting about this case that eventually it got real loud, and Terry finally did plead guilty to the case. The feds tried hard to get the brothers to turn against one another, but neither brother would do it despite the bad blood and not being on their best terms. Their motto was death before dishonor, and on December 12, 2008, they both were sentenced to 30 years in prison. Recently, due to the COVID pandemic, both have been looking for early release from their prison sentence. And in 2020 of May, the brother Terry Flenery, aka Southwest T, was granted early release from his sentence and has been placed house arrest. And so the brother Meech, Big Meech, Demetrius Flintery, has been seeking early release for COVID as well, but has been repeatedly denied the option to go home early for house arrest. The judge has said that he feels that Meech has not changed and continues to promote himself as a kingpin. Now, in June of 2021, a federal judge did cut 3 years off of Big Meech's sentence, and it looks as if, as of now, he will likely be released in the year 2028, and at this moment, he is 52 years old. Since he's been in custody in an Oregon prison, they say that he has earned a GED while incarcerated, as well as undergoing drug treatments, and is showing that he's a changed man. And the judge wrote that Meech was entitled to a reduction because of changes in the sentencing guidelines since he was convicted. So here's the question I pose to you as the audience. Who was more responsible for their downfall? Is it Meech for the partying and continuing to live a lavish lifestyle and bring attention to them and their organization? Or was it Terry for speaking on the phone during the wiretaps and having many pages of documents that became incriminating evidence against them? Some say if Meech wasn't living flamboyant, Terry wouldn't have been on the phone complaining. Some people say Terry should have let him do his thing and you do yours and leave it alone. Either way, it's unfortunate that they ended up getting caught up the way that they did. Now, having a drug empire and being allegedly involved in murders is not a good thing. So I'm not saying as if they were politicians or people helping the community, but it's unfortunate that the brothers ended up being each other's own downfall. In the end, you let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching. See y'all on the next video. Peace. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit that like, subscribe, bang that bell, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.